So welcome back to part 2 of Bob and Barnes Q&A, second Q&A, 11th of March 2021 at about 2:30, or 23 now. So again, to my left, Paul Arnold, and below me is Kevin Wass. Did I get that right? Yes, I did.
Yeah, it's close enough.
There we go.
Well, Kevin's next question was about the tools that we use, hardware and software. And you wrote Contact or Spitfire, but that's kind of interesting because Spitfire runs in Contact for us. So we have both, actually. Both is the answer to that one. We do love Spitfire, and we've got quite a few of their bits and bobs. But in the area that we work in, I mean, we need a pretty mixed bag of tricks because, you know, a lot of the time we're writing with orchestral sounds and sometimes if we're lucky enough to work with orchestras. But similarly, there are quite a few briefs which have got nothing at all to do with orchestral sounds, and particularly TV, light entertainment and whatever, you're not necessarily reaching for that toolbox. So it does just depend on what you're asked to do, what you're asked to pitch on, and then what the sound set will be accordingly. But when it comes to orchestras, we use Spitfire, we've got 8DIO, we've got Audio Bro. In fact, we've just bought the new Audio Bro symphonic strings library.
Modern scoring strings.
Modern scoring strings. And I mean, I haven't yet been able to use it in anger, but we use their brass library. And I love, absolutely love how that works. It's brilliant. You basically have
but you need a beast of a machine to run it.
Yeah, because you have a brass section, but you have each of, you know, let's say 3 trombones, you have each of them laid out separately, so you can get rid of one of them, or you can, so you already have the section effectively, and you still have individual control over each and every one of them. So it will handle divises and all sorts of things. So if you send,
but each one of the brass sections can use up to about 3 or 4 gig of RAM.
Yeah.
So yeah, it starts to
so if you send 3 notes to, if you send 3 notes to the 3 trombones, you hear 3 notes, but played by each individual trombone, not by 9 trombones, if you see what I mean. And Audio Bro have always been quite brilliant with that. Even the LA scoring strings had that level of detail built into it, which was really impressive, because many of the other competitors, I can't think of another one that does do it actually. It's quite brilliant. So this new library it's got all of that in there, but it's all been updated and so on. So I'm really looking forward to using it, but just haven't had a chance yet. We only bought it last week.
Yeah, so to answer your question, yeah, for each of our sections of the, so for example, the orchestra, yes, we use cine samples. We use quite a lot of their stuff for example, the solos. One thing I always love to ask you for, you know, nothing nice than having a nice solo cello. Tina Guo cello is particularly good for that. That's one of theirs. And we have the cine strings, so that's you know, effectively you can effectively have a quartet. And they're very good, wonderfully expressive samples for each individual player. Yes, as you said, in terms of string sections, the modern scoring strings, we also have used orchestral tools. They have we have quite a lot of their libraries. I'm trying to think what other one, take the name off the top of my head. Cinematic Studio Strings, performance samples. We bought those recently. They're Conmoto are particularly good because unlike other sample libraries, this is the first time where it reacts to how you are playing and will play appropriate samples. So rather than sit there going, I'd like to have a nice rhythmic section, dum 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 dum, and a nice legato section when playing a nice slow melody, you can do them both on the same line, and it will figure out what you're playing because it effectively reads it ahead of the game, and it will play you and will use rhythmic samples or legato samples depending on who you play, which is brilliant. But there, so in terms of strings, I would say that probably covers most, and of course Spitfire, as Bob has already mentioned. Brass, Berlin Brass, which is by Orchestral Tools, is a fabulous brass library. Again, we've used Cinebrass from Cine Samples, and the Spitfire, I think they're Phalanx Brass. We've used them a couple of times. That's quite a nice. And they've got some really good low brass. We love some epic deep brass. And 8DIO, they have some ridiculous. I forget the name of the library. Something they've got something ridiculous like 100 trombones, or I forget the name of it. But they've got some stuff which is a crazy set of different brass instruments. Brasses I've always tend to be quite notoriously difficult to get right in samples. Just the way that the brass player plays is just, it either sounds a little bit woolly or it sounds a little bit tinny. I've always found that to be a bit of a challenge, but again, these samples help a great deal. And in fact, recently we bought all the, I forget the name of them now, it's a really bit of bug, I have to look up them. The SWAM, that's it, SWAM samples, software, I think it's software audio modeling. Originally it was, they're particularly designed to work with electronic instruments, where you can sort of, like an EWI, electric wind instrument, where you play a sample, or you can play something on a keyboard with lots of control. It sounds amazing. We've yet to actually go and make much use of it because we haven't had much need so far, but the demos just sound incredible. But to be fair, that's more for solo instruments, particularly woodwind and brass. Again, woodwind, I think Cine samples again. We said Cinewinds and Cinewinds Pro are the two libraries that I think we use the most. Hollywood Winds, I think there are still an older library which we've used for years, but again there was brilliant stuff. Particularly some of their runs were fantastic. In fact, Orchestral Tour had the Orchestral Tour also had some very nice string runs which we would use. And percussion. Oh my God, what's the name of the percussion? There's a Rhapsody percussion I think we use. Again, there's a LADD, which is
Spitfire. We've got Spitfire. One of our percussion libraries is Spitfire.
Yeah, and percussion, and again I think there's LADD, which was the LASS was LA scoring strings. I think LADD is LA dynamic drums. I think it is. By the same by Audio Bro, the same people who did Audio Score Tools. Again, fabulous stuff. So again, it's a whole selection of stuff. I mean, we can go into detail about some of the crazy pianos that we've tried. I remember a couple of years ago trying to update our pianos. We used to use the Ivory going back many years, which was a really good VST of a nice grand piano. We now use, I think, Imperfect Samples, Fazioli, and Steinway. We've also got the audio modeling one, which is Pianotech, which is
Modark.
Yes, Modark's Pianoto, which is fabulous. On certain things, it sounds incredible. Like it's a 14 meg plugin, and they really add up to version 7 now. So it's a really interesting piano modeling sample. It can sound a little bit tinny, a little bit unrealistic at some things, but we've got an emotional piano. We've got which I think was an ADI one, Arturia, which is by Heavy Osty, actually. It was one of the other libraries we used, which is a sample piano recorded really quietly, some playing really quietly, and again it's that beautiful intimate sound that Hollywood do so well, and it's something which we use quite a lot. So again, it's tools for different scenarios. But as Bob,
if you break it down, so if you break it down, you need kind of your orchestral tools. We've got usually more than one option for everything. Over the years, we've built that up. But then you need sort of, rock bands, pop bands, where you might do funk or rock or whatever. So you need a drum kit, a good bass plugin. You need to cater for that. Then there's the kind of, if you get anything that sort of borders on EDM, electronic dance music, then you'll need some plugins to deal with that. So we've got Nexus 2, Massive, Dune. It's just about trying to have a toolbox of things that you can, in some way, that you can use to get where you want to go. And of course, on each and every brief, if it becomes apparent we don't have something for that, or there's something really good that we should get, then we usually buy it, even if it's only for a pitch. We might buy it because our view is that every single one of these VST plugins, once we've bought it, we've got it forever. We can use it on each and everything that we work on in the future, which is not quite the same as hiring musicians. We love hiring musicians, but the problem is they spend their time working on the production of that piece of music, which only has a life, one life, if you like, that life. Whereas, VST, so there's you use it on everything. So there's a real case for investing in VSTs. So
do you find do you find that you use a sort of like a set template though, when you've got, okay, we're doing a thing for this needs an orchestra, then you have a sort of a go-to palette that you might set up so that you can write the thing and then maybe adapt and adjust it accordingly later on to capture
I would
the
say
moment.
we used to have what we call an auto load, and that was actually a Logic thing, where we would spend a lot of time building up a template. And in fact, I still see that quite a lot of film composers, that's all they do. They spend all their time working on an enormous template. Tom Holkenberg, John Powell, you can see the templates are crazy. I mean, but I remember reading an article about a year or two ago, which sort of made me go against that guy. Because the problem and it's a perfectly reasonable problem, is that if you do that, it's always going to sound the same. You're always going to use the same, you're always going to go to the same, your favorite brass sample, you're going to favorite trumpet sample, your favorite timpani sample. You're going to always go to just pick the ones you choose. And yes, it's got, I mean, and also it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes you've got hundreds, literally hundreds of channels of audio, of MIDI, or of choices of instruments. So I mean, it's just scrolling down and trying to keep tabs on a massive section when you've got like a little bit of MIDI here and then like a page or two below it, another bit of MIDI there. It's quite hard to keep an eye on. And so I noticed that there are quite a lot of those guys that have a separate iPad in front of them, with just a way of viewing the whole session, because it's so massive. But the problem
just add something else to that, Barn, that if you come back to that session in 5 or 10 years' time, very unlikely that you'll be able to load it, because your system will have changed so much by then, VSTs aren't found and so on. So there's a real yin and yang with doing that. I totally understand why you'd want to have all of those articulations loaded so that you just focus on writing and you're not doing anything else. But at the same time, the idea of coming back to that session in years to come, which we do have to do periodically, can be a really big problem. You probably can't get into the session. You can't get it to load. So you have to satisfy two sides of the same equation, and it's a balance in the end, I suppose.
What I quite like doing is now I will then, I mean, it's again, it's probably double-edged sword, because without having all the time to put all the articulations in there and get it all set up, it's quite labor, which is quite a labor-intensive thing to do. You sort of limit yourself. But actually, I think for me, it's a plus, because now I will start something and I'll try to come up with a unique palette, a palette which I've never used anywhere else. Sometimes I'll try to deliberately use a string articulation I've never worked before. I remember when you first talked to me about Sol Ponticelli, which is a string articulation way of playing, which I'd never really played with before. So okay, I'll load it here. I'll use this as a particular way of playing strings, because I've just never done it before. And it takes you down a different way of working. I'll use a slightly different palette of brass, So I'll have everything. So ultimately, for me, it's about making each project sound unique, which I think is a much better way of doing it if you are starting from a blank canvas. It's more daunting because you haven't got a huge palette to suddenly choose from. I'm going, well, what's this going to work here? What's it going to work there? But for me, so it's more work up front. But for me, the results are beneficial down the line, because ultimately you are creating, which something I said earlier, is that each project should sound unique. And it's all well and good if every project you do is predominantly live orchestral. All you are doing then is just adding different articulations to your template to help, in theory, make that easy to do. But for me, I like to think of that there are more things out there. Obviously we like writing for orchestra, but I like writing for unique, interesting percussion instruments, more unusual. I mean, one thing which is a sound that Bob and I both love writing for is what we love to think of as basically world music. Actually, I think the first one was indeed Kung Fu Chaos, the only example I gave earlier, where they wanted us to imbue the sound of kung fu and funk and disco. So I remember this is back in 2000, 2003, Googling Chinese music, because the game started in a Chinese dojo. And then as the levels you went on, there were 8 levels, which ended up across a New York skyline, which effectively was a very similar, basically as a riff on Mars Attacks, or the very similar looking aliens coming down and attacking you as you were jumping across these New York skyline. And you actually went across Atlantic on the Titanic. So there was just a very, very classic films they referenced. But you started it.
Just to correct you there, Bart, you nearly got across the Atlantic on the Titanic.
That's true. You actually died off. But I mean, your first level was in a Chinese dojo. Not only did we have back in 2002 very limited choice of Chinese sounds, some of them sounded pretty awful. We were using riffs on sample CDs because none of the stuff on our JV synths or our Proto synths would sound any good. You just really couldn't. It wouldn't sound anything like the real thing. So you'd actually have to refer to. That's another thing which I've always found slightly frustrating way of working, is having to use pre-recorded sample riffs, because they would sound amazing because they're played by a real player and they would sound wonderfully emotive and everything else. But the problem is you couldn't do anything with it. That was it. It was a few seconds of someone playing that. You might be able to pitch it up and down, but you could never change the notes. You could never change it to modulate anyway. It was always fixed. So I remember Googling Chinese music UK and just seeing what came up, and we literally found a website, chinesemusic.co.uk. A wonderful chap we've worked with many years called Li Jiang. I can't even speak his name. Li Jiang, and he was based in Rushden, which wasn't a million miles away from us. They used to run a print shop, but he'd come over from China a few years before and built and brought his family in the UK, but he was very, very well connected to Chinese musicians. Some still over in China and some based over here in the UK. And I just remember saying to him, I said, "Here's the dilemma. We'd like to record Chinese instruments for this game. We've never written for this style. We know it's quite predominantly pentatonic, but ultimately we've never really written for these kind of instruments. How can you help?" And he was amazing. He was brilliant. I mean, one of the things I remember doing, so we discovered an instrument we loved called the erhu, which is a Chinese violin. It's like almost
string
like
job.
single string, and they press it to get the bass, and it's so beautifully emotive. So much so that we used it on a ton of projects ever since. And the dulcimer, the one you tap with the hammers, the harp, that wonderful bloom, that beautiful glissando sound, which everyone recognises as being from that part of the world. Your pippa, which is your flute, and I'm sure there was some other percussion instruments we used as well. But he was brilliant collaborator in helping us not only finding players, communicate some of them, but some of them actually recorded over in China. And I remember one he actually brought over to the UK. She came up from London, a flute player, I think it was, and she couldn't speak much English at all. And the one thing I always remember taking a picture of is seeing our score printed out from what was at the time Logic Audio as a simple line. Here's what it is, and he'd written it on, and he'd put another page of A4 on the other side and converted it to Chinese notation, which is something I'd never seen before. And it's all numbers. You write a root note, and you have to write the numbers depending on how many semitones above or below your root pitch was. Fascinating to do. But again, I wouldn't have a clue how to do that if it wasn't for his help. But this, back in 2003, started introducing our love of world music. And it's something I'm gonna get slightly sidetracked here. Is a lot of what we do is, yes, we're asked to, recreate the sound of other composers. We're asked to create this as a media composer as part of your job. But so many people we talk about it's like developing your own sound. What's your sound? And over the years, we started to establish that the sound that we love writing is basically part of the stuff. But we love stuff from writing games is to mix it all up. Basically, fusion's a horrible, cheesy word to use here, but ultimately, it's what we like doing. We like mixing random instruments together and seeing what comes out at the end. A, it creates something which is hopefully a unique sound. B, it's something which is quite uniquely ours, fortunately. And C, it's quite a lot of fun to do. And so I think a lot of what we do is grounded in the fact that we started out music for games. Rather than starting out music for film and TV, we started in games. Games, there was we had a lot more freedom, I think, to be honest with you. I think we had a lot more freedom. We had a lot more technical issues to deal with. Every few years there was a new console would come out, and all the barriers which were there before have gone, but whole new barriers have come up. but ultimately we had quite a lot of freedom in terms of what we could do musically. And I think this sort of drove our musical aspirations, where we'd say, how about this? How about this? How about this? Because we had bosses at the time who genuinely weren't very musical and didn't really care, and actually just quite enjoyed letting us off the hook and going and letting us on the leash, go and do what you want to do. So I think a lot of this fed into how we started to see our particular sound, and I'll use the game Brick, which we did about 10 years ago, as a good example of this, because Brick was a first-person shooter. It was developed by a company called Splash Damage in South London, and the lead designer is actually a bit of a closet wonderful percussion player. He would actually go on percussion weeks and spend a whole week playing percussion. I was like, you're quite dedicated to this. And he initially said to us, can you make the entire score for this game percussive? And we had to sit there and go, I might repeat this in my last Q&A, but we had to initially say to him, well, let's think about this. Our friend of ours, Chris Sweetman, was doing all the sound design. And so it was a mingle player first-person shooter. Basically meant you work as a team to solve problems, but in the first-person shooter vein. They made some really good first-person shooters before that, so they knew what they were doing. But the reality is, what sounds are you hearing in a first-person shooter? You're hearing the rhythmic sounds of someone kicking someone's arse with an automatic weapon of some description. And what's percussion sound like? So the problem we had was these things were going to clash. There was going to be an awful clash. In fact, if anything, we wanted to do a score which was the opposite of what he asked for, because we knew that something which was kind of like ambient or something like that would have actually sit in a mix much easier than what he asked for. But we ended up having a sort of a hybrid reaction, where I remember Googling around and discovering, we learned what a hand drum was. I'd never heard of a hand drum. Hand drum was a Swiss instrument invented in 2000. It looks like effectively like a UFO. It's an inverted steel drum, and you tap it, and it's very expensive. It's about £3,000 a pop, and each certain areas have different notes. But it's a wonderfully rhythmic, but not only rhythmic, it was tonal, so you could actually play melodies on it, and it sounded brilliant. It was like an inverted steel drum. So we discovered a guy who could play 5 of these, because the problem with these things is that they're £3 a pop. Most people have got 1 of them, but as far as I'm concerned, I said to him, we're the best one in the world. We can't write an entire 2 or 3 hour score of a game in D. As much as I'd love to, we need a bit more variety than this. So we had to find someone who had a lot more variety. We found this guy called Manu Delago, who was an amazing player. He had 5 of them. And in fact, he was touring around the world when we were using it. So bless him. He took his recording equipment with him, and he'd do sessions for us after doing a gig. He'd go back to his hotel room and record some stuff for us and transfer it over. So we had 5 of those. We found UK's premier percussion player, a guy called Pete Lockett, and he played on various Marvel films and everything else. So we got him to play about 30 different instruments. Brilliant. Again, like part of the collaborative idea. We probably part of the gaming way everything is. We always think of this as a collaboration. It's never like we're telling you what to play. It's a case of like, here's what we've got an idea, but ultimately you know your instrument far better than we do. I'm writing it. Most of us are writing on a keyboard here. We might not be writing it in a way which would be accurate if you were to write it on that instrument. So come back to us, tell us what's, let's come up with a line which is more suitable if it isn't correct. And so we did that. So we had percussion instruments, hand drums. We went to our Chinese guys again, and we had 3 or 4 Chinese instruments. We had a soprano voice, we had tuba and vocals, and we had an orchestra and a load of electronics. So it was an enormous production. I remember seeing this spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet, just in terms of ticking boxes. We had 208 pieces of music to write for this, and each box, there's like 10 different boxes for each track, which all had to be filled in to say that we've recorded it. In fact, every single tune that we'd completed had to be exported from our sequencer in 5 different ways to cater for every different person's requirements. I had to do the orchestra on its own, had to do it without percussion, had to do it without hand drum, had to do it without vocals, and export the MIDI. So there's so many different things. So just in terms of completing it logistically, it was a nightmare.
I mean, that's a whole conversation all its own, really, because managing assets and creating assets, especially if you're bouncing out stems and it's being mixed somewhere else, and you know, some of it's going to be live, some of it's mixed with synth lines that we have and stuff, then you know, tracking that, we usually do all that in spreadsheets, but we should probably talk about that on a video all of its own, because file naming conventions, asset tracking, and all that sort of stuff, maybe it's not the most interesting of things, but actually there are many things that we've learned along the way that can be incredibly time saving and labor saving. So we should add that to our list, maybe chat about that next time.
I mean, I think, as you say, there's a lot of, it's amazing how much of our day-to-day job is nothing to do with writing music. It's amazing how much the skills we've had to learn have been nothing. And something which I discovered very early on when I started running a mailing list. Probably, I think it was the first game audio community called VGM in 1998 when I was at Sony. Largely because I was very loud and very social and I liked to talk to people. And after a while, I realised that people knew me but didn't know each other. And so because I was friends with the IT department, I said to them, "Can you run a mailing list?" And it went from there. And one thing I discovered after a while was that it became very apparent to me that everyone joining were, you know, amazing composers, sound designers, audio directors, everything else. But a lot of them had very little experience in business. They'd spent all their time learning the craft of writing music, which is, of course, why we're here, which is brilliant. But they spent no time learning the art of running a business. And ultimately, this is what the story is that ultimately you're in the music business. The two are actually more like a 50-50. But no one tells you that. No one tells you that. And in fact, when I was studying, no one told me this. And so it became a bit of a strange learning experience, having to figure out how to negotiate contracts, how to figure out how to get work, and all those other things, which are nothing to do with your ability to write music, but make an enormous difference on your ability to run a successful company writing music. So it's amazing to me just how much we had to learn on the fly. I always remember the day that Bob and I left Sony. You know, you left the comfort of employment of a full-time, comfortable job with a, you know, reasonably well-known company who weren't going anywhere anytime soon. You weren't thinking you're ever going to be out of a job. To jumping to the wilds of freelancedom in June 2001. I mean, we were very lucky that we knew enough people and we'd actually went straight to our first job. And in fact, I even said to them, we'll give you a discount, but what we'll do is we'll invoice you on a weekly basis. And you're going to pay us on a weekly after that. So they did. So again, nothing to do with our ability to do our music, but they wanted us. They wanted us, and they were very keen, and they were in fact saying to us, "Leave sooner. We need you now." But actually, we said, no, we'll stick to our guns. We're not, you know, because another thing as well is that whatever industry you're working in, especially in any media industry, it's a small industry. The last thing you want to do is piss anyone off, because word to get around you, piss someone off. So we wanted to make sure they wanted to leave. We didn't want to leave any company in the lurch. Wanted to leave them with that we'd done everything we said we were going to do, and that they were happy to. You know, we're like effectively, here's the reins, go on, someone else take over. In fact, hilarity with Sony, when they employed the sound person to take our place, there was no other person in the building who could interview them, so they paid us to interview them ourselves. Brilliant. So we had to come back and interview our own replacements. But you know, but they were honest and said, we have no one up, we can't tell if they're any good or not. So I remember writing a test for them. The irony wasn't lost, has to be said. Anyway, I have gone off on an amazing another tangent as well. So stop talking. I'm going to stop talking now, and someone else can tell me anything else I can ask.
But there was one thing I was going to add to the whole conversation about sounds, and like when I was talking about the different sections, you know, there's the orchestral side of what we do, and then the band side. And then, you know, you've mentioned some of the more unusual instruments and so on, but sort of feeding into the unusual instruments, you can actually have instruments that are created in VST format, which may be based on an acoustic instrument, but they're weird and different in some way. And I'm just trying to think of the company which bought some stuff recently. If I just have a quick look through our library, there's
Sonic Couture, you mean?
No, it wasn't them. It was it might be some of the 8DIO stuff that I bought recently. They do hang on, if you just give me 1 second, I'll find it on my computer and then I'll know. Yeah, like things like the copper phone. That was a free instrument that they were giving away. It was based on some copper sounding, I don't know what, in fact, I don't know what it was, but they'd sampled this instrument. It has a bit of a slightly unusual sound to it. To be fair, it sounds a lot like a Glock, but a glockenspiel, but there is a slightly different tone to it, and it goes into lower octaves. The point of getting things like that is that you never quite know when that's going to come in useful. So I don't know. You get asked to score a TV drama. The chance would be a fine thing. We'd love to do that. But you know, you let's say you get the chance to do that, and they want a unique sound. Well, you know, one way is to go thematically, write something thematic that gives the show a sound all of its own. Another thing is to use an instrument like that, which is recognizable and individual. And I would imagine, like Barn mentioned, the hang drum. The hang drum was that some years ago, and now everybody's used it. You know, you hear it, it crops up all the time. But in the beginning, it was like, oh, that's interesting. It's a sort of eerie sound. And we got another one by 8DIO called the Bazantar, which is essentially a bass instrument, but it's kind of like a 12-string guitar, but on the bass, and it's got all sorts of weird resonances and stuff. It sort of sounds a bit like a bass sitar, is the only way I can describe it. But the point is that it's different. You know, it's different and it's unique. So at some point, that could become the very distinctive sound that you choose to use on one of your productions. That was the one I was thinking of, and I couldn't remember. One called Neo, which is a collection of sort of lubed synth sounds that can be reversed and slowed down and whatever. And again, something like that, you just never quite know when you load one of those sounds and suddenly something you thought that was just going to be an incidental in the background sound ends up becoming the driving force of the music that you write. Because, you know, music, when you write it, or certainly for me, I don't know how it is for Barn or for you, Kevin, but for me, it's not entirely conceived in your head straight away. You put something down, you have a little idea or fragment, you put it down, and you know, you walk away. Sometimes you come back and think, oh, it's awful, and then you start again. Sometimes you come back and you're pleasantly surprised by it, and then you start hearing other stuff, you know, like, oh, it gets there, but I should take the melody there, or what if the bass instrument came in there? You know, it's suddenly, after an ear break, after a period of time away from it, you have a different perspective on it than you did in the heat of the moment when you made it in the first place. I don't know if that's something that happens to you, but it's something that happens to me a lot.
Well, I've done it many a time. I'll write a tune. Let's say I'm lucky and something comes into my head fairly quickly. I can break that tune down instrumentally, and I might then, like as you said, you might sort of take the bass and go, actually that could progress this thing in a different direction if I just use that sound to influence me further on. And I'll kind of write maybe 10, 12 pieces from the original, and then I'll start to segment them and glue them together and see what follows on well and what doesn't. You know, out of 12, you might then shelve 10 of them and keep 2. And in the end, I might have 10, 15 little pieces that make a whole. Yeah. I work like a Lego constructor. A friend of mine, a musician from years ago, he basically said, you like, the way you write is like building bricks. And yet when they're all together and then you overlay with other instruments to kind of join it and glue it together, then it works.
It makes sense. Yeah.
I have that mind. I can kind of glue things together in the same key, and then I'll go back to it and write over the top, and then everything seems to be seamless. I'm also aware that you're talking about many sounds that are around. Sometimes I'll start with the sound. I can go on to something like Piano Book, where people have been submitting their own personal sample libraries. They build them themselves and they put them on there. You go along and you find, I don't know, the guy's got a mandolin that he recorded in reverse, and then he put it through a filter, and then he places it in a you know, on a key bed, and lo and behold, this is some magical noise that you've never heard of before. But boy, does that work for this thing!
Exactly.
And then that'll inspire me to move on.
Yeah. And then, of course, in the process, there's the happy accident, as I like to call it. You copy the MIDI to the wrong channel, and you know, maybe the MIDI was very high pitched, and when you copy it onto this channel, some of the notes cut out because they don't, for some reason, that instrument doesn't play them. And you listen back to it, you go, that's very interesting, you know, and then you go back and re-edit the MIDI to exclude the notes that it's already not playing, and put that back on your other instrument. Or I mean, so many times stuff like that happens, and it can be real gold, you know, and you can't ignore those things. These are the things that are available to us that probably Beethoven didn't have at his beck and call back in the day. You know, I mean, those guys were incredible to me because they were conceiving everything inside their heads, and then, you know, notating.
It's all organic, isn't it? Everything they wrote and everything they perceived was totally organic.
Yeah.
We've got everything to hand. We can touch stuff and it makes a noise, and it will loop a thing or whatever.
You get to try it out.
Exactly. I can. It's an unlimited amount of recording now. It's not tape, so you're not wasting money and time on actual physical tape. If it's no good, you just abandon it and move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
We're a very fortunate age. It really is magical.